Okay, hello and welcome to tonight's Out at Work discussion panel. My name is Caitlin Smith and I am the coordinator of the Resource Center at IPFW. The Resource Center at IPFW is our campus's LGBTQ office that provides LGBTQ programming as well as services and resources for LGBTQ students. Next, I would like to thank all of tonight's sponsors that made this event possible. Tonight's Out at Work panel is sponsored by Safe Zone at IPFW, IPFW Career Services, the Office of Diversity and Multicultural Affairs, and the Resource Center at IPFW. Without these sponsors, tonight's event wouldn't have been possible, so let's give a round of applause for that. Come on. Moving on, allow me to introduce our panelists. Sitting on tonight's panel is Dawn D. Cummings, Executive Director at the Metropolitan Relations Commission in the City of Fort Wayne, Sarah Lauer, the Assistant Program Director and On-Air Personality at Wild 96.3, Christina Mosteller-Hall, who is a Career Counselor at IPFW Career Services, and David Van Gilder, a local attorney at Van Gilder and Trizinka. So why is there a need for this panel tonight? For individuals within the LGBTQ community, there are a variety of social pressures and obstacles put in place for them. The workplace is and always has been the subject of many conversations when it comes to LGBTQ rights. Currently, as it stands, Indiana is one of 29 states where it is legal for an individual to be fired on the basis of their sexual orientation. In addition to this, Indiana is also one of 34 states where it is legal for an individual to be fired on the basis of their gender identity or transgender status. Needless to say, there are a plethora of reasons that we are here tonight to discuss this. Obtaining and finding work for anyone can be a daunting task, but when you add fear of being fired for an identity or status you hold, this can only compound the situation. I can say from my own experience as a genderqueer lesbian that even I have experienced discrimination in former places of employment. One instance of discrimination led to me being sexually harassed in a former workplace. I think it is important to denote how there are instances in the workplace where an opportunity to educate someone about LGBTQ issues can sometimes quickly turn into a harassing situation, much like the one I had experienced. This leads me to our first question for the evening. What are some things that LGBTQ individuals can do to be proactive in making sure that they find a safe place of employment, and how can we identify these LGBTQ-friendly workplaces, industries, and careers? And that's aimed at Christina.
Like, as soon as you asked that, I thought, oh, is this a question that's aimed at me? Yeah, I think that there's a couple of different things that you can do to find either particular organizations or industries that are going to be a little bit more LGBTQ friendly. The first thing is just to do your research. Human Rights Campaign as a career counselor is like my go-to website. When I have a student that expresses concerns about some of those issues and I'm looking for ratings of different organizations, what policies might be in different states, things like that. Another thing that you can do too is through the interview process, examining the organization's website, look at things like their equality statements. You know, does it include anything about gender, sexual orientation, things like that when they're talking about equality? Because even though maybe, for example, organizations, you know, statewide may not be as embracing of some of those issues, there are individual organizations that do provide a lot of benefits, is another key. You know, if they have a good policy for same-sex benefits, then that's another way that you can say, okay, this organization is a little bit more likely to be friendly.
That leads me into the next question. Is it wise for LGBT job seekers to consider moving to LGBT-friendly cities or states? Is there an upside to this, or is there a downside?
I think there's both, actually. Because I think anybody that's a part of any affinity group, your network is so important in terms of, you know, supportive family members, allies, friends, other people in the community that you can identify with that can support you. I mean, that's a really key resource for somebody. So, you know, being in the community that you're from, you're going to have a lot of those roots there. That being said, and I think you can look at like the HRC website, there's some data to back it up. We don't live in the most friendly community, not just in Indiana, but then Indiana itself is not necessarily the most friendly state. So that there can definitely be an upside sometimes too to relocating to somewhere that you know is gonna be a little bit more friendly.
I'm just gonna keep going right on down the line here.
Okay.
So this is a question for you.
Oh, for me?
Yeah. Should you put leadership positions in LGBT advocacy organizations on a resume?
That's a judgment call, I think, on your part. I have a little cheat sheet with notes, and I thought a great way that something was put was, you know, how out do you want to be? And that's a very personal decision that each and every person needs to make for themselves. But I mean, it's just like religious organizations or political organizations are the same thing, where you have that sort of balance between something that's a leadership role at a professional organization, but then it also starts to get into that gray area of more personal information. So I don't think that there's really a right or wrong answer overall. It's just something personally to consider.
Because by doing that, you're essentially outing yourself, so you have to keep that in mind, because it could be a really good work experience that you want to use to get in there, but then you also have to remember that anything you put down that pertains to LGBTQ could be seen as outing yourself unless you like vehemently identify as heterosexual and make that known in your interview.
Right, yeah.
Which leads us to our next question. These next set of questions are over interviewing. What are some like tips on dressing for a job interview, especially for people that, like myself, are gender non-conforming, like, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of where...
I think the important thing is to be both professional and comfortable. I have students, you know, ask me questions like, well, do I have to wear a dress or a skirt if I normally wouldn't? Of course not. You know, you need to dress in a way that's comfortable for you, as long as it's appropriate to the occasion and the industry. I mean, certain industries are a little bit more formal. For example, if you're going to do something maybe in like business or finance, you're going to have to get that whole suit with like the jacket and the pants and the whole thing. Other industries, you might be able to be a little bit more casual, so, you know, that's going to depend.
And I think it is kind of hard to navigate that space, because for someone that wants to go into business, if they're gender not conforming, that's a hard stance to take, because it's so gendered and you have to choose feminine clothing or masculine clothing, you know, and make that distinction. So I think a lot of it does go into researching and deciding, do I want to be employed at a place that adheres to gender norms so strictly? Okay, this one is for Christina and for David. What questions can employers ask legally during an interview?
Well, in Indiana, they can ask an awful lot of questions legally during an interview. But sort of look at it sort of on the negative side. What is it that an Indiana employer cannot do, would be considered discriminatory? And you know, there's on a very basic level. If I'm interviewing somebody for a law position, I'm not going to be asking them about their religion, about their family, whether they intend to have a family, and that kind of thing. Those things are pretty obvious, but because in Indiana, I think private employers probably still would be able to legally discriminate against somebody for gender identity, then they could ask about that. If somebody shows up and says, you know, notice from your resume that you have leadership positions in this thing in college, and tell me about that. I mean, they could be asking you about that, which would even further solidify maybe what they consider to be a suspicion. And that might make a difference, and they could legally do that.
So this, to tag on to
Dawn
that,
probably could ask a
would you like to speak to that question?
Actually, they may be able to ask us questions, but as this law is changing, and there's some things that are changing, they're not going to want to ask, because they're not going to want to know. Because they don't want, because once you know that someone may be gay, lesbian, then if it's illegal If we can tie that decision to the gender stereotyping, which I can get to later on, if we know that, then we could possibly have a charge against them. Sometimes they may not want to know.
And let me sort of jump into that. I mean, in the city of Fort Wayne, they could be in trouble for asking those questions.
Right.
Sort of forcing identity, like gender identity. But I was speaking more generally.
So what is the best way to handle a situation if someone does ask like an illegal question?
It happens all the time. I imagine that even in my office, we've probably asked a question that we shouldn't have asked. And, you know, as an interviewer, kind of like the idea about what you're going to wear or what you're going to put on your resume, individuals are going to make a decision about, A, whether they even want to work at a place that asks that question, and B, how much they want to share. And it becomes, you know, people are who they are, and they're going to respond to it in different ways. You know, you're not applying to a place to set them up to later sue them. Presumably, you're applying to a place and answering questions in an interview process because you want the job. And if it turns out later that you've made a horrible choice and they made a horrible choice and there's just no fit, and then you feel like somebody's been discriminated against as a result of gender identity, for example, you know, then you can harken back to that question that you didn't really feel comfortable answering, and that might be a basis for
I have two questions that are to Christina, but we've kind of already touched base on them. They are, what should you tell your prospective employer about your private life? And what kind of information can employers demand from you? And I know we've already kind of touched on those a little.
So my personal opinion, when we were preparing for this, my first response was nothing. Nothing about your private life. You know, I think it's up to you, but I think that sometimes job seekers sort of feel like because they want to be truthful and honest with an employer, that they need to just keep disclosing information on top of information. And you really don't. You know, a simple question, I know, and unfortunately this question is asked a lot more of females than males, but just, are you married? Do you have kids? Things like that, which aren't legal at an interview, and a lot of people are unaware. So I've often coached students, you know, maybe there's a couple of different ways that you can handle it. First of all, you can sort of, if you can see maybe why the person's asking that question. For example, sometimes with issues of civil and family status, they're trying to feel out your schedule. You know, if you're married, if you have kids, is this going to impact your availability to work somehow? So if you kind of get a sense that's the issue, maybe you hedge it a little bit and say, well, you know, my family's really supportive of my career, I don't have a problem meeting the demands of this job, and you don't have to get into those details. Or maybe even sort of turn it around on the interviewer a little bit and say, oh, you know, why do you ask? Why are you curious about that? And kind of see what their response is.
And I think for a lot of people, they don't realize that they don't have to disclose that. And then I'm kind of on the opposite end of that. I go in, you know, just rainbow because I just want people to know. You know, from my point of view, I'd rather have someone know so then I don't get employed somewhere and then I have to deal with being discriminated against or them wanting to fire me because they found out I was gay. So I just go in unapologetically gay and just find out what happens. Now, I know that's not an approach that everyone can take because, you know, everyone's been out for certain periods of time and maybe not as long, or maybe they're just starting to come out. So it can be, you know, really tough and agitating just to find a job to begin with. So this brings us to being out in the workplace. And this question is for Sarah. What are some pros and cons of being out at work?
Yes, I'm out at work, and in relation to what you were actually just saying, I completely agree with you. I would want to be honest, maybe not right out in the interview, if I could just touch on the last question, but really early on, because, I mean, this is my identity, this is who I am, and that's going to be really hard to cover up long term. So I'm in a position right now in my life where I'm really accepting of my sexuality, my partner, my family. It's not something that I would want to go back and closet myself for a new position. So, and I think, David mentioned something to the point of, do you want to work for a workplace that is not comfortable with you being gay? And for me personally, the answer is no. It's been a long time coming. It hasn't been an easy road for me as an individual in my own profession, so there are definitely pros and cons to being out at the workplace. And it's been a transition for me, and I think some of that is a little bit of self-discovery as an individual, as you're just aging. But I'm in a position now where I have an amazing fiance and just an amazing partnership, and I can't imagine not being completely out at work. For me, that's a little bit too full because I am an on-air radio personality, so I could just be out at work with my peers at work and then actually closeted on the air. And I have done that before, but I decided, why not just be yourself and why not just be out and on the air? So thousands of people hear me talking about my fiance, she's in the room, Juliana, on the radio, and I talk about her and our relationship, and it's not necessarily easy to do, but if I had to compare and contrast the pros and cons, the pros greatly outweigh the cons, because for me it is who I am, it's my identity, and I'm proud of that. I'm proud of my family, I'm proud of my relationship, and I want to be an advocate for that. So I feel like, I would really do a disservice to the LGBT community if I wasn't out at work and even on the air as well. But that's been hard. We were talking about how Fort Wayne can be a little bit more of a conservative community, and that can be difficult. Actually, I've been in radio for about 10 years, and when I first started, I worked with a man who was gay, and he never revealed his sexual identity on the air. In fact, he would maintain the disposition that he was heterosexual and even go as far as to talk about women that he was interested in on the air. And the reason was because we were in Fort Wayne, we weren't in a market that was ready for that yet. And so that was actually kind of the ideology that I started out believing, which was difficult, So I also subscribed to that same thought. But as time went on, it's been such a blessing. I mean, I have, had different situations, been on different stations, and this last co-host that I have for the morning show I'm on now, when we started, we sat down, we talked about it, and I'm like, why don't I just be myself? And it's been the best thing ever. And I feel really great about it, and I hope that I can be an advocate for the community, and other people can, maybe hear my small voice and want to do the same thing. And so I definitely think that the pros definitely outweigh the cons.
I mean, in your situation, it not only benefited you, but then being visible and being out can help other people or teens or young adults that hear you on the radio.
Yeah, it's just a small step, but I have been criticized before in the past, and it actually really hurt when members of LGBT communities would say, when my friends would say, you don't really do much for the community on air. And it was really hard because everyone is going through this, being out at work. That's hard. It's not an easy step to take. So everybody's going through that in some way. And I didn't like being scrutinized for that, but I agreed, ultimately. And I feel like as I just grew and aged and became more comfortable with who I was, I actually owe a lot of it to my fiance. I keep looking to her because of her, she was just so open and comfortable. We also work here at the university and talking to coworkers and stuff about our relationship, and it was just a really big inspiration for me, so I'm really happy to be out.
And I know you've touched on this, but I'll ask the next question anyways. What kind of experience have you had working in a media environment that is geared to an African-American demographic? And the reason I ask is because we had some programming earlier on in the month where we combined, the African-American community and the LGBTQ community, and we had some poor turnout, and we talked about why is that so? This isn't as widely accepted by the African-American community, even locally in Fort Wayne, when we talked about how many African-American LGBTQ individuals that are out do I know, and it dawned on me I only knew 3, and I mean I think that's really sad when I can count at least 20 Caucasian people that are out in the community.
Yeah. I don't know if I can speak to this question directly in regards to like gearing towards an African American demographic, because we do really have a really diverse audience, but the music genre itself is predominantly produced by African Americans. So from that standpoint, being at a predominantly hip hop and R&B format, I do think that the genre itself is a little bit more closed-minded. I do see some strong growth in that area. I mean, you obviously have like, you know, I think this is kind of iconic or like a token, but Macklemore with Same Love, that's a big record that's recognized, but also some more just mainstream artists like, you know, like Kanye West's and Jay-Z's and Beyonce's and Rihanna's have come out publicly to say that, you know, they're an advocate of gay rights, and I think that we're moving in the right direction. Unfortunately, I do think it perhaps is a little bit slower and harder for minority groups. You know, everyone knows it's hard to be a minority, whether that's the color of your skin or your sexual orientation. So for people that have more of an intersectionality and might face it, you know, from a couple of different directions, I could see where that could be a little bit harder.
Yeah, but when you add more than just one minority status
Absolutely.
to an individual, it compounds the situation. You mentioned Macklemore and allies to the LGBTQ community. So what can allies do to be better to help out their LGBT colleagues in the workplace? Have you had instances where you've had some really great allies that kind of vouched for you when you've been in situations that...
Yeah, I've been really fortunate at work at both of my jobs. Everyone is extremely accepting. I'm really surprised. I've had no complaints about revealing my sexuality on air, and from more of an interpersonal perspective with my direct coworkers, I think that, you know, just the small steps they take to actually alter their vernacular, to not say anything like a negatively connoted term like that's gay, you know, in a negative fashion or something. Like, I see people actively change their philosophy and their mindset, and if I hadn't been more out at work, I don't think that that would have happened. So I do think I am a big proponent of being out at work, and hopefully that can continue to change as you develop those friendships. You know, on the flip side, there have been some negative things that have happened, I think, as a result. Like, I can think of an instance where I think maybe just stereotyping in general. You know, our target demographic is women 18 to 34, and we were coming up with different ideas for a promotion. And, you know, one of my coworkers said something to the effect of, well, how would you really know what, you know, women want to do around here because all your friends are gay? So assuming that, you know, my friends would want to do things that like a butch lesbian would want to do versus any other female in the community. And things like that were very hard, but I still think that it's worth it, and I think that overall, just as an ally, just trying to be sensitive of people's needs and trying to be a good friend is the easiest thing you can do.
So in terms of being out in the workplace, it sounds like you've covered a lot of ground in terms of, you know, queer women. Do you think that Fort Wayne is ready for like an openly male gay radio personality?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Caleb. Because I had a conversation recently with a friend who is a gay male, and he was talking to me about how there are some double standards in his opinion. And I do think that that's a really tough situation. I would really hope that someday soon that there is. I know that, I mean, we've had transgender personalities on the air before, or just a gay male that identified as like, you know, her drag self on the air. So, I mean, we have had some of that before. I think it's been a little bit more of like a comedic shtick or like a niche thing. I would hope that it could be just more of a mainstream personality. I don't know if right now, but I'm optimistic.
I think it's hard to combat the, you know, social norm of like masculinity and men having to stay masculine. So
Absolutely.
That's hard for men to be out in the workplace. There was a factory I worked at where I knew that if there was any gay man there that worked there, he was not going to be out because of the jokes that were made. But me, I was fine because I was a woman and it didn't matter as much to them. Moving on, we're going to go to our legal set of questions. So these are more geared towards David. Thank you, Sarah. What laws protect LGBT people from discrimination in the workplace? And at the beginning I had mentioned we're one of the states where people can get legally fired based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. So
I think in Indiana there are protections for public employees, but not the private employees in that score. And of course, in the city of Fort Wayne has an ordinance, and I'm not sure if any other major cities have. Indianapolis does, yeah.
They're Evansville, and I think South Bend.
Okay, so some of the major places, you know, would have protections that specifically mention LGBT and sexual orientation and gender identification that would be protected. But other than that, I mean, there's general anti-discrimination rules respecting, for example, just gender. You know, it could be that in your heart of heart you know you're being discriminated against because of your gender identity, but it could, you know, if you back it up a little bit, you might say, well, I'm really being discriminated against because I'm a woman, and I happen to be a woman, you know, that's identified, but I may be lesbian, or I may be discriminated against because I'm a male, but I'm not acting like, or they perceive that I'm not acting like a male. So, you know, you could be pretty creative, and I can't tell you how successful you might be in that, but those would be kind of creative ways you could protect yourself in a situation like that. I know Dawn might have something to add to that. I keep referring to you too. This is your specialty.
We do have protections in Fort Wayne under the ordinance, but unfortunately, it doesn't have much teeth. It's really pretty much in name only. What happens if someone wants to come file a charge with us, we file it, and if the respondent doesn't want to respond, we have to drop it and dismiss it, which is unlike any other protected class. However, there is good news because it is changing in the big picture. EEOC has come down with directives to agencies like ours that if people come in with issues of sexual orientation, gender stereotyping, transgender, we are to draft charges as a gender claim and as a gender stereotyping claim. Now, this is at the beginning, and I have no idea where it's going to go. Somebody eventually, it's going to get the big case, and we're going to figure out what's going to happen. But we know we can't get the protected class. It's not going to go through Congress right now. None of that's going to happen right now. So the EEOC has said, let's let's change this, let's do gender stereotyping. Not only does the EEOC do this, but also HUD and fair housing claims. If people are denied housing, given different housing terms, those types of things because of sexual orientation, gender stereotyping, transgender. It is a gender stereotyping claim, and we are learning how to draft charges. We're learning how to investigate these cases because they are a little different. And what's really important in these cases, it looks like the evidence that they're really going to look at are comments and things like that are made in the workplace. So what's important for people is to journal these things, because if you're going to come to us and file a charge, we're going to need to know those things. And even in a regular harassment case, a sexual harassment case, journals and notes and things are very important. Comments made, who they made, what time they were made, how many times they made them, all those types of stuff is going to be important for us if you come and file a charge, and that's to protect you. If you go to us, if you go to any other civil rights agency, they are directed to take these claims and make them gender stereotyping claims. So if you do go to one of these agencies, especially mine, they better jump on it right away. They need to say, okay, we're going to file this under gender, Title VII, full federal claim, and it's going to be under gender stereotyping. They've got all the computer, we have IMS, which is just a computer system, but they've made little glitches in there so we can click which one we need. They're really setting this up to pursue this. Like I said, I don't know where it's going to end up. Sooner or later, it's going to end up in a big court case somewhere to the Supreme Court, I'm sure. But from now on, we go to the charges, and they're classified as gender stereotype.
Now, I know you had mentioned sexual harassment, and there can laws against sexual harassment be used to protect LGBT people who are harassed
Yes,
at work?
and that has been, the EEOC has directed it as such, and so has HUD.
And I know a couple of years ago, wasn't there some type of protection that was trying to get passed in the city for transgender individuals? Could you speak more to that situation?
That was back in 2009, and quite honestly, it wasn't very pretty. I was involved a little bit in that. As Metro, we're not an advocacy group. I know one of your questions was how do we advocate, but we don't advocate, we enforce the law, and the only thing we can do is what the law allows us to do. So at that point, back in 2009, when that was trying to get past identity and also transgender, that what we weren't proposing it, we were helping it get through, we were drafting it and doing those types of things, but we know it didn't get very far. I seen comments on blogs that I would never have imagined to see. Like I said, it wasn't very pretty, but times are changing. Oh, that's 2009, this is 2014, so, and who knows?
I definitely think the city of Fort Wayne has some area to improve, some room to improve in that area, because the HRC, when they give their ratings out on a yearly basis, Fort Wayne didn't rank very high to begin with, unfortunately. I think we only got like maybe 30 points out of 100, and most of those were for protections of sexual orientation. I think there was maybe like one area where we got 1 point for gender identity, so there's definitely a lot of room to gain in that sense. So you said that you're not an advocacy organization, so does the Fort Wayne Metropolitan Human Relations Commission do anything to prevent or remedy discrimination, or is it more of it happens and then people come to you guys?
I mean, the main is enforcement, but we can do things like this, education and outreach. But we need people to come and listen and know what their rights are. I have a feeling that a lot of people in this community don't even know they have a right to come and file under federal statute at this time. One of the things that happened in 2009, all the excuses why we shouldn't do it, it's not important, it's not, and I said, we don't have a problem here. Because one of the first questions that were asked in Metro, how many sexual orientation claims do you have? We don't have very many, okay? And I understand there could be various reasons for it. Number one, the law has no teeth. Maybe education, I don't know, but that was one of the very first questions asked. So maybe, besides enforcement, to go out and educate and make sure people know what their rights are. You have a right to file under a federal statute now, which is huge, it's big. It was never like that. Again, where it's going to go, I can't tell you. But we need, if you've been discriminated against, we need people to come and file a charge and know what their rights are. I know it's not easy, and but I need to let people know that they have this right.
Thank you for all of those wonderful answers. I didn't even know that until tonight.
Can I jump in and just add a little bit to
definitely.
that? One tool that people have used, especially in harassment kind of cases, is to seek a civil protective order through the small claims court process. And what I've seen in my experience is that sometimes is less successful in a situation where there may be harassment that is same-sex harassment, people who break up and then, it happens everywhere, right? That somebody's stalking or it could be in the workplace, it could be outside the workplace, and then there are protections under state statute for a person who feels like they're being stalked or sexually harassed or feel like they're in danger as a result. And sometimes those things, those general protections that are for everybody are overlaid by something that is less understood by some judicial officers than it probably ought to be, and treated somewhat differently. But it's a tool out there. And the only other thing that I'd say is that whenever somebody decides that they want to bring a claim, whether it's through Metro or if they want to do something in the protective order area, they have to understand that part of that process is going to involve some pain. It's going to be public. It's going to be, it could fuel a fire. And I think people are always making those kinds of decisions when they decide, when they're looking at a possible legal remedy. Is it worth it? And I'm not saying it is or isn't, but we shouldn't ever castigate anybody or find blame with them if they decide for themselves that this process, this legal process that might well be available to them, is just something they don't want to pursue because of any number of different reasons.
Well, and I think it's hard to do in any situation. In the situation I was in, I had to tell someone that I was not only being sexually harassed, but it was based on my sexual orientation, because it didn't start until this person had found out about my sexual orientation. So in essence, I had to out myself in order to report the harassment. So I mean, you have multiple layers of outing yourself to people that you haven't outed yourself to, or if you're even out at work to begin with, you know what I mean? And then going through the process of filing something and possibly, having to be somewhat re-traumatized and going back over what you had gone through. So I mean, it is, on one hand, it's like we need more of these files to be claimed, so then people know that there's these problems out there, but then there's so many people that are afraid to, or they don't want to go through being publicly humiliated or having their name dragged through the mud and online forums or whatnot. So it's, it's a complex situation. I think it really depends upon the person on what they want to do in that situation.
And it is very difficult, and it's time consuming. It just depends on the person. And anytime you, like you said, anytime you go file something in court or you file something publicly, it's always a down, it's always a negative.
If you have an extra 2 hours someday, just go down to small claims court and just look at the people there, and even the protective order hearings are open. You can go in there and observe and listen to all kinds of sordid tales about what goes on in this city. And, and for somebody to be brave enough to tell their story to a judge in that situation is difficult.
This leads us to our last question for Christina and David. Transgender individuals may have other challenges, such as how should they handle gender or name changes in the past. So say someone was female and then they had transitioned to a male status. How can they handle that change going into not only being hired in, but then what can that employer have access to? Because I've heard situations of people going and finding out that they were transgender, then that person getting fired. So, it's a very complex situation.
Oh.
I always pun complex situations.
Great, complex situations. That's a really good one. I'm not really sure how much access people have in terms of information under legal names, things of that nature. But one of the things that I'm really surprised about that people don't know in terms of the job search is you can choose your references. And I think a lot of people automatically think that they have to provide, every supervisor they've ever had at every job. So, one of my pieces of advice would definitely be, when you're choosing references, when you're inviting people to speak about your past work experiences, pick people that understand your situation, that you have a good relationship with, and that's one way that you can, make sure that all that information is consistent. Just don't offer information that you don't need them to have.
There's been some interesting legal cases of the last couple of years about, especially people who have switched genders, who have gone through medical procedures and so forth, and questions about, can they get a passport, what does their birth certificate say, can they change their birth certificate. There have actually been 2 cases in Allen County in which a person has sought a legal change of name and also asked the court for relief so that they would get an order directing the records division to change their birth certificate from a female name to a male name, for example. And the court has declined in both instances to do that here in Allen County, although a judge in, I think, Elkhart County did it a couple of years ago. On the basis saying that there's really no statutory, there's nothing in the state law that gives the judge authority to make that kind of decision. And the judge in these 2 cases reasoned that let's leave that up to the state assembly, the General Assembly, to figure out how to do that. So in a particular case, the question became, his birth certificate said he was a woman, and he's going to get married to a woman, and could a marriage license in the state of Indiana be issued? Because same-sex marriage is not legal in the state of Indiana. Nor could they go to Massachusetts or someplace and get married as a same-sex couple, and then ever have that recognized in the state of Indiana. So it was really a barrier for this couple. And it is not yet resolved. There is a way under federal law to get a passport issued, and you may be familiar with that. It's kind of an interesting thing. I've never done it, but you know, there's a couple steps that somebody has to go through to get a passport issued in a new gender. And it requires a doctor's certification and a photograph that shows the way you look now. You know, and that seems kind of simple. And it is relatively simple. So it seems to me you could get your passport changed, and then you could use that as an official identification in situations where that becomes an issue.
And I know they did open up the door to the changing your passport is much easier now
Right.
compared to like a license or birth certificate or name change. Do you happen to know, like, in terms of like estimated cost of just someone having to change their name? I know that like in Indiana, someone had said it was anywhere from $300 to $400. I mean, you think about that combined with trying to change your birth certificate and everything else. I mean, it can get kind of, add up really quick.
Yeah, a name change is not that expensive. I mean, you have to pay a filing fee to the court, and it's in circuit court, so that's $157. And you have to publish it in the newspaper. If you look in the newspaper, there's little tiny little publications. So-and-so is changing his name. And that costs, I don't know, a couple $100, maybe $400 tops, depending on what you put in there. And then usually you have to have a lawyer do that for you, so you have a few $100. So it could cost $700, $800 to change your name.
Is that normally what happens in other states when someone goes through a name change? It's required to be like in the local newspaper?
Yeah, and I think the reason for that is really mundane. It's to prevent people from changing their names to escape their creditors. If you owe a bunch of people money and you want to disappear, one easy way to do it is to change your name. You don't exist anymore. And so I think back when, ages ago, when the statute was put together for name change, that was the main reason it had to be published.
Because I mean, from a perspective of a women's studies major, I could see that as being problematic if they had the person's birth name on there. I mean, because sometimes transgendered individuals, that's kind of traumatizing to still be called their birth name because that's not what they want to be referred to as. So I find it, I don't know, kind of crazy that you have to have it in the paper just to get it changed because you're making it very public, whereas, you know what I mean, there's other things that people do that aren't forced to make that very public.
Yeah, that's the thing about legal proceedings. Mostly they're public, and you just hope no one's paying attention that day.
Well, that is the last question we have.